Okay, guys, we were talking about the Grand Canyon. And we were talking about some of the problems that it poses, just the physical problems that it poses for somebody who would claim that the Grand Canyon just happened by chance or by time through a river. One of the things I do want to point out is we've got some pretty good evidence of things happening quickly when it comes to canyon-like formations. In fact, there's a place in Alabama called the Little Grand Canyon that is very, very good evidence. Here's what happens with water under great deals of pressure. You got the Teton Dam failure in 1976 in Idaho that caused a massive canyon. Here's the Cumberland County Dam failure, the Hopes Mills Lake. These are all caused strictly by water. Here's a better shot. One of the things that folks don't realize is just how much force is behind water. And so if somebody were to ask me, Brad, how do you think the Grand Canyon was formed? I think a much, much better explanation would be that there was probably a global flood, or there definitely was a global flood, but that the global flood played a major role in it. Let's see, what else do I want to show you guys? So here's the first lie. And remember, again, to set the stage, we talked about the fact that almost all of the state board curriculums, the educational constitutions say that they only want students to learn the truth. They don't want lies. They don't want opinions, etc. Well, here you've got the first textbook saying the Colorado River cut through this layer upon layer of rock over millions of years. Well, it would have had to have gone uphill. It would have had to have gone from an elevation of 2,800 feet to over about 6,500 feet, roughly 4,000 feet up. It just, quite frankly, it didn't happen that way. So there's our first lie. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lust. Jude 18 and 19, how that they told you there should be mockers in the last time, who should walk after their own ungodly lust. These be they who separate themselves, sensual, having not the Spirit. All right, so why then would we keep putting these in the textbooks? This is a quote from Dr. Julian Huxley, one of the world's leading evolutionists. He was asked in a television interview, why did the scientific community jump at Darwin's ideas? He said, I suppose the reason why we left at origin of species was that the idea of God interfered with our sexual mores. In other words, we couldn't act the way we wanted to. We couldn't live an immoral life. And so when this came along, we realized, hey, we can. Sir Arthur Keith said, evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Yeah, exactly. Romans chapter 1, verse 28. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. So, time and time again, what I'm trying to show you guys is, isn't it beautiful how you've got men who will, first off, will admit something that is just, to me, that's hideous. That's non-scientific thinking. That is just total biased garbage. And yet the Bible told us all along that that was going to happen. They didn't want to retain God in their knowledge, so God gave them over to a reprobate mind. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11, for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion that they should believe a lie. So, 'Let's ask this question for just a minute. Is it possible for a person to go insane?
Based off that picture, yeah.
I think we would all say yes. Okay? Is it possible for a group of people, not just a single one, but a group to go insane?
Yes.
Absolutely. Guys, if you are not familiar with what happened all the way back November 18th, 1978, there is a very stark picture reminder of it right there. 913 people were found dead and bloated after drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. So, is it possible for a single individual to go crazy? Yeah. Is it possible for a group? Absolutely. What about, is it possible for an entire nation to go insane?
Oh, yeah.
The answer, obviously, here you see a picture of Hitler coming up, he and his Third Reich. Or, how about this guy? Somebody tell me who that is.
Mussolini. No. Stalin?
Yeah,
Stalin. Stalin.
Red Army. Oh, that's Russian.
The question, is it possible then for the entire world to go insane? Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. Out of the great dragon was cast out the old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. So the point being, guys, you can get a large following to believe a gross error. Let's go back in history to when some of this old earth, young earth stuff really started to transpire. I need you to have a pretty good working knowledge of how things shifted in our history. James Hutton kind of kicked us off in his book, Theory of the Earth. He was one of the first people that really proposed that the earth is much older than people thought. Okay, now set the stage. 1700s. In fact, his book came out in the mid to late 1700s. 1795, Theory of the Earth was published. So here's a little timeline. Think with me for a moment. Prior to that, everybody on the planet had pretty much tied their existence to a young earth and to a biblical worldview. So now in 1795, he prints this book. We think about, okay, what all was happening during that time, 1795. Obviously, we've got the revolution. You got the United States saying, hey, we want to be our own. We got revolutions going on all over Europe. But yet, this guy puts out this book. It remains somewhat quiet because it was buried because of all the other stuff going on in the world. Who is then going to write a book a few years later, roughly 60 years later?
Darwin.
Charles Darwin. Okay, check out this. It says, before radiometric dating was available, many people had estimated the age of the Earth to be only a few thousand years old. But in the 1700s, Scottish scientist James Hutton estimated that the Earth was much older. He used the principle of uniformitarianism. Principle states the Earth processes occurring today are similar to those that occurred in the past. He inferred that they had just been, he observed the processes that changed the rocks and land around him were very slow. He then inferred that they had just been as slow throughout the Earth's history. He hypothesized that it took much longer than a few thousand years to form layers of rock. So, prior to this, prior to radiometric dating, everybody's thinking, young. Then this guy comes along and he jumps onto this idea of uniformitarianism. He says the present is the key to the past, which realistically the Bible is the only perfect key to the past. I would point out there's a, for those of you who have an interest in this area, there's a pretty good book written by Terry Mortensen called The Great Turning Point that gives a really solid perspective of how the old Earth view became popular in the 1800s. Okay, back to our page for just a minute. So there's James Hutton's name in history. We then have another guy you'll see at the bottom of this page who played a critical role. His name was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was a Scottish lawyer. He wrote a book called The Principles of Geology, and I do want you to remember that. He wrote the book in 1830, and there you see a copy of it. In it, he said basically that that he was coming to false conclusions. He was using futile reasoning, ancient doctrines sanctioned by the implicit faith of many generations, supposed to rest on scriptural authority. He said that, talked about accusations founded on religious prejudices. He said men of superior talent like himself, who thought for themselves and were not blinded by authority or the Bible, would come to this realization. And he said his goal was to free science from Moses. So what did Mr. Lyell do? How did he affect the history of all of this that we're talking about today? Well, it was Mr. Lyell that helped develop the geologic column. And in fact, it was in the early 1800s that each layer of rock was given a name, like the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period, the whatever period. So again, let's think about where we are. If we go back to our chart for just a minute, we ask the question, okay, what do we have that's factual? We know the Grand Canyon exists. We know there's two different interpretations. Number two, we know the Earth has layers of sedimentary rock. The evolutionists would say the layers form slowly over millions of years, while a creationist would say the layers are from the flood of Noah. Let me remind you again, evolutionists are always trying to erase that line, making students think that their interpretation is a part of the fact. So what about that geologic column? What do we need to know? Obviously, we know the only place that it's actually found is where? The textbooks. In fact, I want you to read this. This is one of those textbook pages that they no longer print this way, but it's something worth holding on to. It says, if there were a column of sediment deposited continuously since formation of the Earth, the entire history of the planet could be reconstructed. Notice what's highlighted in green. Unfortunately, no such column exists. Of course, they don't admit that anymore, and they're not about to. In fact, if the geologic column existed in one location, guys, it would have to be at least 100 miles thick. So, here again, this is lie number 2 that is in the textbooks that they're teaching, and yet state standards are saying, hey, we want the truth. We don't want lies. All right, let's get back to the Grand Canyon for just a minute. Have you ever thought about the fact that each one of these layers that you see on the screen, if these layers are different ages, so each one was laid down at a different time, why in the world do we not see erosion marks between each layer? In other words, if where the yellow line was the top millions of years ago, it should have eroded down into the layer before it. And yet we don't see erosion lines. We see very stark, contrasted, very clean separations of all these different layers. If the layers are different ages, then why are there no layers of soil between the layers? I think part of it is because of the flood itself. Now, you think with me, if we were to take a beaker and we put in that beaker mixtures of water, of clay, of sand, of gravel, all these different layers of stuff, and we shake it up, and then we set it on a counter and we leave it alone for a year, that's basically what it's going to look like. It's going to settle according to size, according to weight. And that layering effect is what we're seeing all over the place. Very clean layers. That's what we see in the Grand Canyon. That's what we see all around us. The point being, guys, that points more towards a global flood. This is a page out of the actual court case that took place here in the state of Tennessee, the Scopes monkey trial, also known as the world's most famous court trial. That was before O.J. Simpson, obviously. Notice what it says. The crust of the earth is arranged in a series of horizontal strata of varying thickness. The lowest layers are obviously the oldest. So part of the evidence that the evolutionists used at the Scopes monkey trial was this idea of the lowest layers being the oldest. And at first glance, that does sound pretty good. But let's think about science for just a moment. What happens, for instance, when we have running water that runs through a particular area? What do we get? Well, let's see. We know, for instance, let's see if I can find the right slide. We know in moving water, multiple layers form simultaneously with the current. So as water is moving, you see how it's kind of pushing out like that? Fossils found up at the top were deposited first, therefore they're older. Ironically, the fossils found here at the bottom would actually be younger. Do you see? Let me back that up, make sure you guys see what I'm talking about. Watch the screen for just a minute. So let's say that water's moving from left to right, and that the purple striped stuff is sediment. And all of a sudden you lay a fossil at the top layer right now. And then it keeps on extending out, keeps on extending out, keeps on extending out. You've got an old fossil up at the top, and a young fossil would be down there at the bottom. So can we say with certainty that just because something is at the bottom that it's oldest? The answer is no. That's not accurate. It's not scientific. All right, so let's go back to, let's go to South Dakota for a minute. Mr. Timmy Walker is a preacher up there. We did a couple of meetings for him. Some of the students at Bear Valley actually did a campaign up there. There is a museum in Rapid City. If you ever get a chance to see it, you need to go see it. Inside that little museum, there is a classic case of what we're talking about, this idea of circular reasoning. On the wall, it talks about different layers being 70 million years old. So you see on the screen, it talks about a geologic time scale. And and I should have gotten a better picture of this, in the small print, it talks about the fact that the reason they know it's 70 million years is because they found a dinosaur-like creature in that layer. So here's a picture out of a textbook. Scientists use index fossils to determine the age of rock layers. Is that what we're doing? We find a dinosaur in that layer. We say the dinosaur lived 65 to 70 million years ago. Therefore, that layer 65 or 70 million years ago. Now, here's an interesting thing. Literally right across the display from that is this creature here. And they say this guy is 100 million years old. We ask the obvious question, how do they know that? The little placard, guess what it says? Because it was found in a certain layer. So we're dating the fossil according to the layer that it's found in. And yet over here on the wall, literally within seeing distance, we're dating the layer according to the fossils found in it. It is literally circular reasoning. In other words, the striatal layers are dated by the fossils, then they turn around and they date fossils according to the striatal layers found in them. Let's see. Look at what evolutionists themselves say about circular reasoning for just a minute. This is a page out of a Ginkgo biology book. Notice what it says. Up at the top, the layers of rock can be dated by types of fossils they contain. Then we come down here and it says, so they're dating the rocks by the fossil. Then it says, scientists have determined the relative times of appearance and disappearance of many kind of organisms from the location of their fossils in sedimentary rocks. So now we're going to date the fossil by the rock, and up here we dated the layers of the rock can be dated by the types of fossils they contain. Guys, if that's not a classic case of circular reasoning, I don't know what is. Here's what the evolutionists themselves say. Intelligent laymen has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date the fossils and the fossils to date the rocks. He goes on to say the geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling the explanation are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings the results. R.H. Rostall says, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks. The relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms that they contain. Derek Ager said, ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. But look at what he goes on to say. Apart from the very modern examples, which are really archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. O'Rourke said, radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not first been erected. All right, so let me get this straight. If we didn't have this geologic column that was already built on circular reasoning, then radiometric dating would be no good. That's exactly what he's saying. Niles Eldridge said, paleontologists cannot operate this way. There's no way simply to look at a fossil and say how old it is unless you know the age of the rocks it comes from. He goes on to say, and this poses something of a problem. If we date the rocks by the fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about the patterns of evolutionary change through time in the fossil record? I mean, these guys, deep down, they get it. They understand, they know that this is garbage. But they're not going to stop. Again, O'Rourke said the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insists only on using concepts because circularity is inherent in the duration of timescales. The charge of circular reasoning and stratigraphy can be handled in several ways. It can be ignored as not the proper concern of the public. It can be denied by calling down the law of evolution. It can be admitted as a common practice, or it can be avoided by pragmatic reasoning. Larry Azar said, are the authorities maintaining on the one hand that evolution is documented by geology, and then on the other hand, geology is documented by evolution? Isn't that a circular argument? And yet, let me again point out, this was used in the world's most famous court case, that the oldest layers are obviously the oldest. And yet, that's not what the evidence shows. Here's another picture I want you to look at for just a second. Notice anything about what I've circled? They're all limestone. Okay? Which begs the question. How do you tell the difference between 100 million year old Jurassic limestone and 600 million year old Cambrian limestone? They would say it's by index fossils. In other words, whatever little creatures you find in there. Now, we've already talked about this guy. Remember what we talked about him?
He has the eyes.
Okay, he's got the really complex eyes, which are right here. So there's a trilobite eye. We talked about the fact they have the most sophisticated lens ever produced by nature. The eyes of trilobites have never been exceeded for complexity or acuity. What else did we talk about? What was the big deal? I showed you guys a fossil.
Trilobite and then
Shoe.
oh yeah, that's right.
Sandal.
So you got a trilobite that's supposed to be 500 or 600 million years old that was found in a fossilized sandal print. I'll show you a couple of different pictures that I didn't show you last time, just to kind of give you a better feel. There's an up-close picture of one of the trilobites. There's another picture of it. So that begs the question, how did that happen? Obviously, it was aliens. Obviously, you got aliens that visited the planet millions and millions of years ago. One of them stepped on a trilobite and left that pattern. Because, guys, this is an ancient limestone that must be 500 to 600 million years old. There's some images just to kind of give you a feel for what these guys used to look like. But I think all of you would agree with me that realistically, a better explanation is they didn't live that long ago. Here's another one we talked about briefly, but I do want to point it out as just another lie. Lie number 4, lobe-finned fish are still alive. So you got this picture trying to sell the idea that these creatures walked out of the water, and yet we know today these guys are very much alive today. I would point out the picture you're looking at right now, that's from a 2004 biology book talking about evolution of amphibians. Here's another one from a fairly recent book. This is by Samantha Weinberg, A Fish Caught in Time. Check out what it says on the inside cover of this book. Fish Caught in Time is an entrancing story of the most rare and precious fish in the world, our own great uncle 40 million times removed. This is a picture of fossil hands found in Cretaceous rock near a ichthyosaurus. Point being, there should not be fossilized hands. Can you guys see? There it is. There shouldn't be fossilized hands if that's the case. 18-million-year-old magnolia leaves from Idaho shale were still green when the rock was first cracked open. Fossil bees, allegedly 25 million years old, contained ancient germinating bacteria in their abdomens. So, again, the point being, guys, all of this is make-believe when you really start looking at it. Ironically, Darwin was one of these guys, he did not like round numbers. So, again, we go back to the two guys that we talked about earlier. You got Charles Lyell that says, hey, I'm going to print this book, Principles of Geography, that basically is putting out this idea that everything happens slowly over time. You got James Hutton, who proposes that things are much, much older than we'd ever thought before in history. Charles Darwin comes along and he says, you know what? I don't like these round numbers of 100 million years or 200 million years. So it was he who basically said that one of the deposits, the Wealden deposit in England, he labeled it at 306 million years old. 662,400 years. Where did he get that number? He literally plucked it from thin air because he thought it sounded more scientific. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this, but again, I'm trying to impress upon you guys the fact that we have evidence. Jerry, what happens if I find a fossilized tree that starts right here in the Carboniferous period and goes all the way up through the Cretaceous period? Should that happen?
No,
No.
absolutely not.
And yet, we've got the fossils. Notice what it says. In Germany, France, the British Isles, Nova Scotia, California, several eastern states, fossils that extend through several layers of sedimentary rock have been found. These are called polystrate fossils. I mean, ask yourself this simple, basic question. How long would a dead tree stand upright before falling over in your town?
Oh, man. Not millions of years. But long enough.
It's gonna decay and rot, is it not? And yet, what I'm going to show you over the next few slides are trees that have been fossilized upright going through several different layers. There's another one. This one, by the way, that's a petrified tree. You got standing petrified trees found in Yellowstone National Park. This one is actually, it was put in a book called In the Minds of Men. This is a polystrate fossil tree passing through sedimentary rock, suggesting, quote, rapid deposit in that particular layer. These are two trees in a Ginkgo petrified forest in Washington State. Over 200 species of trees have been identified in that particular region. Here again, you got more trees petrified, clusters of standing fossilized trunks of conifers in the petrified forest. Some of the trunks in this area are 4 meters tall. Again, this one's going up through the region. So, guys, when you look at some of these things like this, understand that geologic column that they show prominently is garbage. You should never have a fossilized tree going through several different layers. And yet, hopefully you guys can kind of get the picture that we got lots and lots and lots of evidence of them doing just that. Questions, comments so far? I like this one. 30-foot petrified tree is one of hundreds found at the Kettles coal mine near Cookeville, Tennessee. The top and the bottom are in different coal seams, dated thousands of years difference in age. So apparently that tree just stood there for thousands of years. Why in the world are the coal seams nearly always found on layers of clay or rock? If you think about it, wouldn't that be poor soil to support the growth of a forest? A better explanation is, guys, there was a flood that dramatically changed everything, and what we're seeing in this fossil record is a result of that. This is a polystrate fossil in Nova Scotia, Canada. There's another one. And another one. This is petrified wood running through about 12 layers of slate. Notice, I'm going to outline it here. This is the wood. It is physically passing through 12 layers of slate. How do you get wood through slate? Because slate allegedly laid down hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of years ago. There's another one. And this is kind of an interesting one. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see a guy who is holding a fossil of a creature. It's actually an aquatic creature. And the evolutionist explanation was that this guy took a header straight down through several different layers. And that his body rotted away, was carried away, and that the creature's skeletal remains then hardened, it fossilized, and that's how they found it. A better explanation is that it was covered rapidly by something like a flood, just like these trees. If you look very carefully at the bottom of this picture, guys, to me this is one of the most impressive pictures. You see 3 men standing at the bottom of this rock base. These are 5 fossilized trees going through several different layers. So you got polystate trees upside down, extending through many layers, including layers of coal, which these evolutionists basically 2 choices. Number 1, the trees stood upright for millions of years while the sediment formed around them. Or number 2, the trees grew through hundreds of feet of solid sedimentary rock looking for sunlight. Guys, evolutionists don't have an answer for this. But a creationist does. In fact, a creationist not only has an answer, we've got a working model for it. On the screen, you see an aerial view of Spirit Lake just outside of Mount St. Helens. There you see an underwater picture of Spirit Lake. Let me back up. Those are all trees that have been stripped of their branches. Full-grown trees that were washed into the lake when that particular volcano erupted. There you see them inside the lake. That's what they're doing in the lake. Point is, if you look at that picture, you realize, okay, these trees are going down, standing straight up. You got all the different sediments filtering out according to their weight. You look at that picture and compare it to that picture. And then you think about the fact that we know it takes short amount of time to be able to do this if you got a catastrophe or a flood. Let me get back. This is a piece of chopped petrified wood in Arizona's petrified forest. You can see clearly the chop marks from an axe. We've already talked, I think I showed you guys the picture of the mummified dog in a tree. Lie number 5. Layers are not in different ages. Questions, comments so far? Thoughts, questions? All right. Let's go here. 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface does not have even 3 geologic periods appearing in the correct consecutive order. It becomes an overall exercise of gargantuan special pleading and imagination for the evolutionary uniformitarian paradigm to maintain that there were these geologic periods. In spite of the fact that the geologic column does not exist except in the textbooks and the minds of those who believe it, people who believed in it changed their worldview away from the Bible flood geology to a uniformitarianism worldview. How did all this happen? So we've talked about Hutton. We talked about a guy named Charles Lyell. Now let's add the third key component. You got a guy named Charles Darwin, who is fresh out of preacher school. Just like some of you guys, he gets a position on a boat. The HMS Beagle. It is supposed to be a 2-year journey. It ended up being 5. Right as he is getting on the boat, guys, guess what he is handed? He's handed a copy of Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, from a fellow by the name of John Stephen Henslow. John Henslow gives him that, by the way, it says Reverend there, that's because that's what he went by, that's not what I call him. Henslow gave him the book, but literally told him not to believe it. He basically was giving him the book as a skeptic, wanting Charles Darwin to be a skeptic and to kind of laugh at what Charles Lyell was doing, and yet it had the opposite effect. Charles Darwin got down around the Cape of Africa, and he looked and he saw these layers of rocks. And basically that was kind of one of the transforming moments of his life. He had been reading Lyell's book that talked about slow things over time and layers. He looks and he sees these layers down around the Cape. And let you read for yourselves one of the comments he made. This is in a letter that he wrote to Alfred Russel Wallace. He said, "Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but at last was complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and have never since doubted, even for a single second, that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all of my best friends, would be everlastingly punished. And this," he says, "is a damnable doctrine." All right, so we got to stop right there and talk for a second. How many people do you think have basically bought this same deal? Little by little, I'm going to accept some kind of worldview, because if I accept what this says, then it's damning my mother, or my brother, or my dad, or my girlfriend, or whatever.
Even religion,
What do you think, guys?
Religion's been built on that hypothesis. Charles Chase Russell, the Jehovah's Witnesses, he just didn't want to believe in hell. So he just wrote it off. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, that definitely happened.
What else? Who else?
But as you alluded, you pointed out earlier, I can't remember the person's name, but believing in God and the Bible would not allow them to live their immoral lifestyle. You know, they'd have to leave their immoral lifestyle that they've been enjoying for all this time. And
So you got two things working here, John. Good point. You got the immoral lifestyle, and you've got if I accept this, I'm basically mentally sending my family to hell. Guys, do not lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of people who you are going to come in contact with who are sincerely real in their belief in a God and religion, that are in denominations, but they're sincerely wrong. And probably the biggest hurdle in converting them is going to be what we're talking about right here. It's not going to be getting them wet, because if they really are open to the truth and open to what the Bible says, they'll eventually hit the point where they realize, yeah, I need to be baptized. But that last massive hurdle before they actually get in the water is not the fear of getting wet. It's the fear of, what am I casting on my family if I do this? What judgment am I now laying down for all these people behind me if I go through with this? And that's huge. It's very, very big, and unfortunately there are a lot of people who allow that to be the stopping point of their conversion. They come up to the point where they know they need to make a change. They know they need to obey the gospel, and yet because mom and dad didn't, or because somebody else didn't, and usually it's somebody who's dead that can't go back and fix it now, they don't want to make that change. How do you get them around that?
Some of denominations or just everybody?
How would you get, if you're studying, Jerry, with somebody?
Yeah.
You're studying with me, and I'm a Methodist. And we get up to that point, and I realize the truth, but I also realize if I do what you're saying, that all of my family's lost.
Well, I take you to Luke 16 with the rich man Lazarus. I believe that's Luke 16. And I just kind of let you know that, you know, if they are there, which, you know, I'm not God, if they're there, they don't want you coming there. Because the rich man basically said, hey, send Lazarus back to tell my brothers. You know? So the rich man didn't want his brothers coming there. So I say if they are in a lost state, they don't want you to come there. They don't want you to be lost with them.
Okay. James?
I would bring up 2 points because I kind of deal with this with my family.
Okay.
Trying to get people out of our family religion. I tell them, well, you realize the truth, so it's truth. Just because you don't act on it because of fear of what that might imply about your family salvation doesn't change anything. You still realize that this is truth. It's going to happen whether you do it or not. So that's the first thing. The second thing I try to emphasize is you could start a new family tree, and you could ensure that your children and your grandchildren don't have to face this problem if you start now and commit to Christ and His church.
Absolutely. I think the point here is, guys, you've got to get them to the point where they intellectually realize there's no way around it. Now, whether they accept it or not is going to be an emotional decision. But intellectually, they need to know they're in a box they can't get out of, period. That the only door for that box is the truth that they need to be converted, they need to be baptized into Christ. And while they may choose not to do it, that doesn't, like James is saying, that doesn't change the truth. Because what's going to happen is, they may never come back and stay with you again, but for the rest of their life, intellectually, they're going to know they got a problem, a big problem. And they've got to try to justify that for the rest of their lives. And, you know, a lot of people, that weighs pretty heavily on, and eventually they'll come to a knowledge of the truth. Any other comments, thoughts on that?
I think also you can kind of prioritize someone's life. Looking at Matthew 10, 37 and following.
Okay.
Jesus is saying, if you put your family before following me, then you're not worthy of me, and basically you're going to lose your life. So either we can lose our lives and our family has lost their lives, or like James has said, you can start a new family tradition and gain your life, and your family can gain their lives.
Yep, absolutely. Hey, that's one of the things I don't think we preach and teach on enough in the church anyway, and that is, guys, we're called to love God more than anything, more than our family, more than our wives, more than our children. We don't do that. The reality of it is, in most homes, it's very backward in that we put our children first, then maybe our spouse, then God. Sometimes spouse and God are flip-flop depending on who we're talking about or whatever. Let me put this slide up there because I want you guys to see that. This kind of rounds out the history lesson that I've been trying to show you guys today. So we got Hutton, we got Lyell, and then lo and behold, Charles Darwin, in the second edition of his book, and that's going to kick me out to, hold on just a second. In the second edition of Origin of Species, he dedicated it to Charles Lyell, which, you know, should be a little bit telling in and of itself. Let me get down to that slide again. The whole thing, though, when you really stop and analyze it for just a moment, you realize the whole thing has been built on a house of cards, and it's just waiting for somebody to push it over. The problem is textbooks today won't push it over. They won't even challenge it. Here we go. So there is the dedication. Second edition, dedicated with grateful pleasure as an acknowledgement that the chief part of whatever scientific merit this journal and other works of the author may possess has been derived from studying the well-known and admirable principles of geology. So Darwin basically fessing up, just saying, look, this is where I got it from. Let's talk about this for just a moment. I would contend that evolution and atheism are religions. And I want to just share with you very quickly why I would say that. Number one, because if its followers believe it can violate the first and second law of thermodynamics. In other words, it gives time, space, and matter power to create the universe and life. First law of thermodynamics says you can't create stuff. Well, their theory would say something created something. They're violating that. Second law says everything is wearing down. Everything is going into a chaotic, disorderly mode. And yet we know, according to their theory, it went from a chaotic explosion to an ordered universe. Calls for faith in scores of things that have never been observed, like matter creating itself, life from non-life, animals producing a different kind. Number three, evolution is religion because members who no longer believe are excommunicated. Does that sound like some of the religion things of the past? Also, only members in good standing are considered worthy of a judgment. I mean, if you think about it, you've got the high priests of evolution out there. It attempts to provide answers to basic questions in life, like who are we, why are we here, where did I come from, where am I going and when I die. Number six, it defies nature, or it deifies nature and evolution. Evolutionists like to focus the discussion on the scores of examples from microevolution to draw attention from the fact that there is no evidence for the first five meanings of the word evolution. Questions or comments?
Would you back up to that slide that had those 6 reasons on it?
Yeah. Let me get back there.
5 and 6.
Okay. Right. Let's see. There we go. How's that? Can you read that?
Yes, sir. I got it.
Any other comments, thoughts, questions? I'll show you this slide just because we hadn't really thought about it. The way fossils are made, we know today that it has to be very quick. So you see, for instance, in this case, the dinosaur being rapidly covered. Eventually, the fleshly part goes away, the bones are there, the bones then get replaced by diatomaceous earth, and eventually enough erosion or water happens that allows us to come along and discover part of it. I was going to look and see if I can find a couple of good amber slides too. Let's see. I think it's in the other one. While I'm looking for this, guys, I'm going to go ahead and send this email so that you all who are online right now will get it. Let's see. Debate topics. There it is. It should be coming up in your boxes. So if you have any questions, you can hunt me down, holler at me, whatever. Let me see if I can find this other.
There it is.
There we go. There's nothing real. I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to mess with y'all too bad, although I am going to mess with y'all some. I'm not finding the one I'm wanting. Sorry. All right. What I'm going to do is let me pull that out. On Thursday, we'll start with the debates, and we will go for a pretty good length of time. The only thing remaining in this class, we're going to discuss some things on radiocarbon dating. We're going to discuss some things on starlight and time, some of the other questions that routinely come up whenever you're dealing with Christian evidences. I would like for us to watch a DVD together because I think, number one, I want you to be well versed in this area, and I think it's a very telling DVD. It's called Expelled. Features a guy by the name of Ben Stein. It's very good. In fact, Wayne, I will probably be sending you a copy of that for next.
Copy, Brad.
Do you? Okay. But on Thursday, what we'll do is we'll start out with the debate. We're going to spend a little bit of the class reviewing some things. And then Monday, guys, after we deal with things like starlight, with radiometric dating, some of the other issues, and we watch the DVD, we're done. Class will be 100% over. So it is 4:30 right now. Consider yourselves blessed. You're going to get out 15 minutes early. For those of you who have paper to turn in to me, consider this your 15 minutes to work on that and wrap that up. And I will look forward to seeing you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.